This is one of the princess lines in the book that's decorative, but there are no instructions to it. So when you're thinking about this and you're drawing your picture, you want to make sure that the princess line crosses the bust point. So it comes down to here, and we've got a seam line right there. And then the line needs to come up and cross over the bust point so that it still fits. But it doesn't really look like a princess line as much, and you can hide the dart. So this time I'm going to pivot this. And I'm going to experiment a little bit. If I want that line to be similar right there, I'm kind of starting with it, and where do I want that to go? So that looks good right there. So I could clean that up with a curve and make that look a lot nicer. The other thing I want to be careful about doing with this one is to make sure that I've got a right angle right here. I could make it pointy, but the picture that I'm going with is a smooth curve, so I'm going to be careful about retaining that and make sure I just have a right angle right there at the bottom of that. So now that I've made the decision of where to put this curve, I can do that and still leave the dart right there. So that's what I'm going to do. Is that all on the page? Yes. So this is a design line, and as long as it crosses over the bust point, you can choose where to put it. You do want to keep that a right angle. And I like my other curve better than this one. Except that it's long. So I want that one smooth, continuous line. Yeah. Okay. And this one, well, it's going to attach to that other piece. We might need to smooth this little area out a little bit, but I closed that dart, it opened here, and now I'm just going to separate it the rest of the way. And I'm going to trim off that little point right there. And I'll use my curve and make sure that this is smooth. And I might lose a 64th of an inch right there. But I made it smooth. And this one, same 64th of an inch. And I kind of feel like I need to do that one again. But since you can rewind it as many times as you like to, maybe not. I drew my design line on it where I wanted it to be, and because the dart fit within that, I left it where it was. If it had been in the way, I would have moved it. So I'm going to set this out of the way and get out the pink paper. Now, on this one, because in my picture I have a seam right here, I'm going to leave that on and add seam allowance right here. And then this little area, I still need to retain my right angle that's coming from the corner of the seam line and my right angle that's coming from the center front right here. And then I'm going to blend those two together. So even though this area might not be quite perfect, I'm just going to trim that little bit. So you can think about it from either direction. And by that I mean from adding the seam allowance direction or fixing the stitching line direction. But the seam allowance needs to end up 1/4 of an inch away and nice and smooth all the way around. Okay, so this is my center front right here, but it has to have a seam allowance because that has a seam allowance. And this one, which is the upper section of the front right here, is the center front, but it needs to be on the fold so that it looks like the picture. So on this one, I'm going to draw the grain line and the symbol for putting it on the fold. And it's common for pattern makers to actually draw the grain line in red. That would be a good habit to get into as well. And I'm going to add my seam allowance where I have paper to do so, and then I only need to glue it on where it's missing. And that saves you time, which is important at work. And you can do that the way that your teacher tells you to. If you're in a different class and she wants all the seam allowances added separately, or he. And then this one, if I extend that line out and the neckline out, then I can draw a line between those two corners and pre-miter the corner. If I had my back neck right there, then I would use my back neck, because very likely the back neck is going to be more like that, but this works. And when I put my back neck with it, I might have to trim it a little bit extra. So I'm just going to put that on the edge. One of the important things about being the pattern maker is that you also have to plan ahead for fabric usage. And part of planning ahead for that fabric usage is doing it in such a way that you use less fabric. And planning your paper usage is a natural extension of that. So I tend to try to use as little paper as possible when I'm doing this. Rather than cutting it out of the middle. And then there's another time that I could have added notches in advance. And those are perpendicular, but I'll check it with the ruler. Perpendicular to the stitching line always. I think when I started making patterns, one of the most frustrating things to me was where to put the pattern on the page. but that just comes with practice. You know, so you use the least amount of paper, which is one reason I like you to plan ahead and leave it on instead of cutting it all off and gluing it back on. Something you might as well start practicing now. So automatically on this one, you're going to need a little notch right there so that when you're sewing that together, that notch matches up with this seam, because you'll sew this seam first and then you'll sew the long one. That's another thing. Planning the order of sewing can be kind of tricky. That's where practicing sewing comes in handy. Sometimes in a work setting you'll find that you won't have to do a lot of sewing, because if you're just making patterns and someone else does the sewing, you might not be doing the actual sewing, but you need to know how so that you can plan ahead for the seamstress. And often you'll be doing your own sewing, so you need to be prepared for either one. If it works better for you to have both hands touching the table, then you should do that. The most important part is your outcome needs to be nice and smooth, so that when you're through, when you run your finger along the edge, there are no bumps. The shape of the outer edge of the seam allowance is what's going to determine where the stitching line ends up when you sew. And the shape of the outer edge of the pattern is going to determine the way it fits and hangs when you wear it. So neatness and precision in seam allowance, adding it and cutting it, is essential. That would make an excellent quiz question. If it was me, I would watch these videos sped up a little bit if you don't need to see every little bit. If if I had the ability to leave them on regular speed for part of the time and speed them up, I would do that as part of editing. But I can't do that yet, so you'll just have to go down to the little settings gear and click on it and change the speed to 1.5 or 2. And then just push pause if you need to go back and slow down. So even though I have that dashed right there, I made sure that I used one smooth cut stroke. I don't take a bunch of little cuts. I take a whole one cut motion. Another excellent quiz question. One long, smooth cutting motion. Not a whole bunch of little ones, just like an illustration. One long, smooth line. And it's going to look a lot nicer if you erase some of those little dot-to-dot edges. I wouldn't do that at work, but you know, it looks a lot nicer on your homework. And then I'd use my notcher right here and trim out my notches. And trim all of the clip all of the notches. And there is that one. Don't forget to add your name. That's a Decorative Princess line. With seam allowance here, no seam allowance here. I guess I don't want to do that on the green paper, do I? I think this is easier with a highlighter. So the grain line on this one is easy because it's on the fold. But the other one, you're going to have a few options because if you have a stripe or a plaid, the grain line on the side body is going to be part of your design choice. Well, no, it isn't either on this one. Your grain line is going to be parallel to that center front because it's touching the center front. So I'm just measuring out 2 inches on either side, and if I had my 2-inch ruler, that would be a lot easier. Is that parallel? So this is parallel to the center front. And I need to get out a red pen so I can do my grain lines in red. And I would just put one glue dot on each. You don't have to glue them to the paper really tight.